You've done the Scrum training, you've done the team forming agreements, you have enhanced your branching and merging strategy. For all intents and purposes, your Scrum teams are moving faster than ever. So, why does it still take 6 months to get anything to our customers? Hi, I'm Dacy, otherwise known as Big Agile, and let me guess what your teams are dealing with. Your team's finishes a sprint, ready to deploy, but maybe your data center operation says, we only have deployment windows once a quarter. Submit a change request and we'll review it in 3 weeks. And by the way, the people reviewing it have no idea what that change is. How about this one? Your team identifies a critical technical investment that would accelerate delivery, but finance says, show me the detailed ROI analysis for the full fiscal year. Where's your capital authorization request? We'll review it within the next budget cycle. Or one of my favorite ones, your team desperately needs to add a designer or hire a specialized engineer, but HR says, well, we need to open a rec, we need to get multiple approvals, we got to post it for 30 days, we got to interview, and then we got to wait for the start date. That'll be like 4 to 6 months. So your developers end up iterating every 2 weeks, but they're trapped in a system that's designed for annual budgets, quarterly releases, and hiring cycles. So let me paint a picture that's a little bit more full of what I see in organizations everywhere. So you've done the work, you've trained your teams, you've got product owners who understand value delivery. You have, go-to-market teams that are ready to go. You've got 5 Scrum teams in a product group that are running, smoothly with 2-week sprints, and they're delivering working product every so often and collaborating beautifully. And, the retrospectives are really generating good improvements. So your 2-week sprint cycle, gets batched into, let's say, a 3-month release cycle. Value sits waiting and is invisible inventory, and feedbacks get delayed, and risks actually increase because you're deploying, larger batches less frequently. So I tend to think of it like this. I've got 3 drawings here. I've got my Scrum teams here. And they're operating really well. They have a backlog. And what I find, though, is the teams really aren't the problem. It's the system around it. And here's why this is so insidious is because like HR and finance controls, they kind of control what we call the purse strings. Operations, they control the go live, or you have these policies in place where your developers can't release directly to production. So it has to go through a change control board. We've seen this movie before. And those people aren't being malicious, by the way. They're doing exactly what they were designed to do. And they're protecting the organization from, risks, financial or otherwise, and ensuring compliance to the SOC 7, policies or whatever it might be. And so they're maintaining governance and stability. That's exactly what they were there to do. But their control systems were actually designed, I believe, for a world of, predictable annual projects. These had distinct phases of large batches, minimizing variation as we go. And so those control systems are now becoming the constraints of your organization. So if I go back to that image, imagine if we were just to put little lock symbols, over finance and operations and HR and all of those different groups. They don't necessarily want to be that way, but that's how it ends up being in the organization, and they don't even realize it. So what we're really talking about here when we say enterprise agility is we're not just trying to scale Scrum practices. That's what I get hired a lot for. We're trying to create agile organizations. That's really what we want to talk about here. Teams can deploy when they have value to deliver, not when some group or the calendar says that it's allowed. Finance should enable fast decisions, with small batch authorizations instead of forcing everything, whether it's a $50,000 investment or a $5 million investment, it's got to go through this, annual planning cycle. We want HR who can staff critical needs in weeks, not months. We want to develop people for, collaborative excellence instead of individual heroics. Most teams, what will happen is they'll create some bad habits because of some lack of the skill. That's now baked into your organization. So the quicker we can get the right skills or cross-pollinate those skills, typically the better we'll be. Now we're creating what Mike Cohn calls in his book, Succeeding with Agile. He calls it far from equilibrium conditions. I'll put that in quotes. And what that is an organization that's always adapting, always evolving, instead of one that resists change, tries to return to the comfort zone. I like to call that organizational gravity. And so I know what you're thinking, but finance and HR and operations, they have legitimate concerns. We can't just ignore governance, financial controls, and risk management. And you know what? You're absolutely right. I'm not trying to eliminate controls. We're just trying to design or redesign them so that they support agility instead of stifling. And I get it. This is hard. Change is hard, especially when you're asking people to redesign a system that they've worked for decades, systems that have shaped their very careers and systems that, frankly, prevented real disasters in the past. We celebrate that. But here's the truth. Your agile teams will only be as agile as the slowest, most controlling function in your organization. And right now, for most organizations, once we get the product teams up and running, those tend to be like finance, HR, data center operations or technology operations. Sometimes if they are not part of our product development team, they can cause a great deal of constraint. And a lot of times we say this because they control the purse strings, either the money coming in, we need new servers, we need this, we need that. So even tech ops will do that as well. Or they control approvals, or they control when value can actually reach the customer. And so the question isn't necessarily how do we scale Scrum and Agile? The question is, how do we create an organization where these control functions, very important, enable agility instead of constrain it? And that's what we're here to talk about today. So in this coming up section, I want to talk about how organizational controls can stifle agility and give you some real data and context about that. So I'm going to show you 3 organizational control systems that usually either enable your transformation or strangle it. And I want to be really clear. I am not blaming HR, finance, or operations. These systems were designed for a different world. They were built for stability, predictability, and control, but they're now actively kind of working against the agility that we strive for. And so this is where leadership, in my opinion, becomes absolutely critical, because without leaders who understand that these barriers exist and have the courage to redesign, then the agile teams don't stand a chance. We can do as best we can, in the trenches, delivering value, but it'll get stifled at some point. So let's talk about HR, the system that was designed to reward bad behaviors. Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? The performance review. So I want to show you a performance review that is really all about individual achievements. Okay. And you basically can sit here and look at the evaluation criteria. I took this just from an image on the internet, but most of us are familiar with whatever HR policies that you have and how these tend to reward individual contribution or individual performance. And I'll tell you, one of the first things when I sit down and talk about Scrum or any kind of agile process is the word self-managing, self-organizing. And the management dogma starts creeping in. They're like, well, if everybody's responsible, none of us are. And it's like, it's dogmatic. It doesn't really work for professionals. Professionals want to do the best we can. And so when you look at these performance reviews, you can almost just see that individual, top-down approach. So I want to tell you a story about a developer. We'll call him Chuck. And this story just breaks my heart every time I tell it, because I see it play out in dozens of organizations. And Chuck was a fantastic back-end developer. If you're talking about a software team, these are the people that really do the heavy lifting of getting the data up and into the presentation layer. And that's where a lot of the business logic is hidden. That's where a lot of the controls are hidden. And he was great at it. And he was consistently a high performer, on his annual reviews. But when we were transitioning the team to be truly cross-functional, we actually needed a lot of our back-end developers, is what we're calling them, to kind of learn more of the front end. Nowadays we might call them a full stack developer, even there's a different word for them now. But the point is, there's not always just back-end work that we need that helps us move features forward to the customer's hands. We needed everyone to develop some kind of skills, like a lot of times front-end skills or DevOps skills, to kind of understand deployment, become more T-shaped a lot of times is what we'll call it. And Chuck essentially refused. He came to me and says, I'm more productive staying focused on the back end. That's where my knowledge is, and that's where I'm getting reviewed on. And that's what gives me my raises. If I start spending time learning more of these other things, my output goes way down. And he's afraid that his performance review will suffer and maybe he will lose money. Y'all hear what I'm saying there? So here's the painful part. Chuck was not wrong about those concerns. His performance metrics are based on his own contributions, performance, individual utilization, whatever you want to call it. We really can't penalize him for trying to stay in his lane. But I was trying to convince him that we have to change the word productivity. What does that really mean? We want to optimize for delivery to the customer, not optimize for his utilization. And that might require him to know other skills. And the other thing, you're going to be a lot more marketable in this day and age. If you only know one skill, you're going to have a hard time finding a job. So I was trying to pivot and make it a little bit more palatable for him. But the team needed, more cross-functional capability. They needed a more generalist, not all these specialists that were there. And I'm not against specialists. They have their place, but we needed people who could pick up work wherever the constraint was, even if they did go a little bit slower. But the HR system said, stay specialized. That's how you get promoted. And so when we talk about HR and what can we do to mitigate that, enter the balanced scorecard. This is one that I usually showcase just from an online session. Where we get a lot of these ideas is from a lot of great writers and researchers. And, people typically intrinsically prefer individual work over group work accountability. And that's a hard thing for us to swallow sometimes. And so we're uncomfortable trusting our careers, to the outcomes that depend on others. And our systems typically reward individual output with narrow specialization, not necessarily, team outcomes. So we need more of this balanced scorecard approach. And what I like about this one here, they're all a little bit different, but I just want to give you an example of one where you have different areas that you're going to be graded and scored on, whereas customer here, financial, education and growth, and maybe internal processes. And if we can start scoring individuals that way, they may be more enticed to help us with the productivity of the team at large. But here's the truth. You cannot have a truly agile, cross-functional, self-organizing team when the HR systems are, designed to identify and reward individual specialists who, maximize their personal output. It's just not possible. And the system literally is telling people, stay in your lane, maximize your numbers, or you won't get promoted, no matter what we're saying in the trenches. And so this is a leadership challenge. HR cannot fix this alone. It requires executives to say, we're redesigning how we develop, evaluate, and reward people because team outcomes and versatility in the organization matter more than the individual utilization. All right. So a company you might be familiar with that did this is Yahoo. During their transformation, they understood this and they asked employees, since adopting Scrum was what they did, how was your sense of accountability and ownership? How has that changed? How has collaboration changed and how has morale changed? And so they were measuring the shift from individual to more of a team mindset, but more importantly, they started building new systems and team-based objectives, peer feedback loops, growth frameworks that recognized individual skill, but also collaborative impact of how they were doing with that. So that's creating an agile organization. That's kind of what it looks like. And so Yahoo redesigned HR support systems to account for team level accountability. And so, HR is a big part of that and is a big motivator on how people come to work and their frame of mind. But I want to, switch gears a little bit here and then talk about finance, because in product operations, typically how we fund projects is a big, impact to how we're going to manage our roadmap planning process. And so I call finance the gatekeeper that can't let go, rightfully so. I'm not mad at them. That's what they're here for. But if you have I've got just an example of a traditional, project approval process with phase gates like analysis, design, build, test. This one's pretty elaborate here. In traditional project management, finance controls the purse strings through phase gates because they don't deliver funding, and if unless they buy into what it is that we're trying to do, and so they maybe not release the next round of funding until you get completed with one of these phase gates like analysis. They'll release more when that design is done, and then so they need these distinct phases to determine when something is technically feasible before they'll actually capitalize it, because there's all these other rules about capitalization, capex and opex and things like that. And I love how Mike Cohn also says in his Succeeding with Agile book that even through a sprint, when we deliver some feature, that is already proving it's technically feasible. So you could account that for that delivery, but they're just not set up that way. All right. So if we go back to sprint and say, here's these iterative and incremental cycles of sprints, we're not doing phases, we're delivering actual product increments. But in Scrum, we don't have those distinct phases. So finance just basically freezes and they don't know how to declare feasibility. They don't know when to capitalize versus expense. They can't reconcile the iterative delivery nature, with the annual budgeting cycles. And while they're out there figuring that out, our agile teams are just stuck, waiting for approval to do work that they already know needs to be done. But here's what's deeper, I think, and this is the real problem, is finance is still trying to fund projects when they really should be funding teams. And, so I wrote a blog about this not long ago, and I think this visualization really captured this. Think about what happens in the traditional module. A project gets proposed. Finance says, show me the business case, show me the ROI. When will it break even? What's the payback period? They do all this analysis to approve the project and then allocate the budget. Then 6 months in, the market shifts. The team discovers that, the original assumptions that we were operating under are now wrong. Customers actually need something different. But now finance says, no, this is what we approved, this project. So we did the ROI analysis of that particular project, and they're not willing to change. You can't pivot without going back and through the approval process. And, you can understand why that is, but, software and product development projects really aren't like that. So then again, the team's trapped. They're forced to deliver something that's no longer valuable because of what got funded, not what is now. So imagine a different model where instead of finance funding the projects, they fund stable teams. And so I'll go back to this image here, a product team that has a clear mission. The team gets a budget, not for the project, but for their capacity to deliver in an area of their product discovery. And so the team discovers something isn't working, then they can pivot. They can learn what customers need and pivot to that. And so they adapt. The ROI analysis, really isn't about, will this feature pay back? It's about, is this team with this mission, creating more value than they cost? And so when you can annually budget, I'm going to have this many people on this product team, is a lot easier than project by project. So we let the product management, the go-to-market team, and the stakeholders, manage the capacity of the team, and of course, trust them to do that. So the truth is that nobody really wants to say out loud, the detailed ROI analysis on individual projects is terrible. It's mostly an illusion anyway. Finance is spending weeks on, spreadsheets, making assumptions about adoption rates, it's like revenue impact and cost savings. And, that stuff won't be validated for years. And so meanwhile, the team's just sitting around waiting. And so I feel like it's all an illusion anyway. And finance will give, they'll throw back terms at us like, well, we got to track CapEx and OpEx and all that. So let me talk about that problem, right? The capitalization challenges, they're still there. The Scrum and Agile doesn't make them go away. But I feel like they're easier to navigate when you fund teams instead of projects, because you can then amortize costs across the team's portfolio of work rather than trying to trace, they try to trace every hour to some specific project for capitalization. And by the way, those developers that are putting those hours in there, it's one of those things anyway. So it's really just an illusion. But again, making this change requires leadership. Finance directors and CFOs, they don't wake up one day and say, you know what, let's throw out this project based funding and ROI analysis. They're never going to do that. So executives have to sponsor this change. They have to say, hey, we're shifting from, funding projects to funding teams, which also requires some level of new organizational design to product groups and things like that we teach. But the thing is unraveling these detailed ROI spreadsheets for every single initiative and tying that back to measuring value and throughput and making fast decisions about where to invest, maybe monthly at the latest. We have these innovation councils that we entrust to do that. So that's definitely a hard shift. But I'll tell you, here's a shift that might actually be the hardest one that I encounter a lot of times is operations. And whether it be deployment operations or just the operational mentality of people doing work. And a lot of times their success is measured by utilization rates and things like that. So I've done a lot of blogging and even some cool tools to help us. Let's refigure some metrics that actually help us capture what we're doing, and I call it flow efficiency, DORA metrics, and things like that. Those are some really good metrics to start with. So check us out on some of our blogs. We have some of those. But traditional thinking says keep everyone busy. If people aren't working, we're wasting money. So maximize utilization. That it makes intuitive sense. People need to be busy and doing work. But remember that a 6-month project that could have been done in 2 months if people could focus is still there. That's the cost of the utilization trap. When everyone is 100% utilized, our work sits in queues waiting. Delays compound, context switching destroys that productivity. And ironically, you're going slower, even though everybody seems like they're really busy. Okay. Now, my question is, would you ask or would you pay 20% more to get a critical enhancement out in 2 months instead of 6? Every executive, I think, would say yes, but here's the truth. You don't get there by adding people or working harder. You get there by removing delays, by having fewer and smaller queues, by adding what I like to call strategic slack to the system. We built systems that don't do that a lot of times. And so we have to shift from managing people's utilization to managing workflow delays, from local optimization, sub-optimizing locally, to value stream throughput, which I go back to this image here. Let's have a portfolio board where we look at all these different value streams and what are the holdups for that value to flow from our customers. So I hope what happens is you see the pattern. These aren't minor friction points. These are deeply embedded control systems that were designed to prevent variation, ensure predictability, and maintain the status quo. They're doing exactly what they were designed to do. But that design is incompatible with organizational agility, and that's what we have to have the courage to stand up for. So creating an agile organization means redesigning those control systems, and that requires leadership. Leadership with the courage to challenge decades of management orthodoxy or dogma. And so I want to show real data. I promised y'all that in the video here, proof that agile organizations, creating them, really worked. And so I want to show you data from real companies that created these agile organizations. Not necessarily the global giants that everybody kind of quotes, but 3 examples where leadership actually drove system-wide change. So, well, and this one may be a global giant, so I'm probably violating the one thing that I was saying here, but I'm going to talk about Salesforce. Salesforce, it is almost Halloween, or it is Halloween today that I'm recording this. And, October 30th of 2006, it was largely believed that Salesforce was operating in waterfall. And then Halloween Day, they were transitioning to Agile in one day. That's a hard change to make. But Salesforce did it, and they committed to that enterprise change. And so they were founded in 1999 and had grown to $450 million in revenue with over 2,000 employees by 2006. But they'd slowed down dramatically. Releases had dropped. You can go do some research on this. Releases had dropped from 4 per year to just 1. Customers were getting less value. They were waiting a lot longer for it. So leadership didn't just say, let's do Scrum and engineering. Steve Green and Chris Fry, backed by the executive sponsorship, redesigned how the entire organization worked. And I've got this first year of transition data that says 94% more features were released in the first year. They had 38% more features that were developed and 500% more cumulative value delivered to the customer. And so a consequence of that was actually that their revenue doubled um, over $1 billion in the next 2 years. And so you can look at, Salesforce cumulative flow charts, and they've got a lot of good content on slide shares. But what made it work is they had to work with finance on new capitalization models. They had to be at work with operations on deployment cadence and security controls, and all those things were still important. And of course, they had to work with the go-to-market team, like support, with release management and HR on how teams were evaluated and hired for. So this wasn't really just a Scrum rollout. This was creating an agile organization, and leadership was driving that change across every function. So 500% more value. I mean, that is a big, substantial increase. Leadership drove that change, and that's a great case for it. Now, another one that I want to talk about is called Systematic, and they're from Denmark, and they were basically a culture that was striving for CMMI, level 5 certification. And it was a 400-person independent software developer. They work in defense and healthcare and manufacturing, and they were already CMMI level 5, which means they had serious process discipline and control systems. And so leadership made a really bold decision of instead of saying, Scrum or CMMI, they said Scrum and CMMI, or Agile and CMMI. So they redesigned their processes to support both discipline and agility. And the results of this were great. They had a 50% reduction in defects, 50% reduction in rework and total work required. And you could even say that that's a 50% reduction in process overhead. So they did all that while maintaining the same level of discipline. And so when you look at that, all of these reductions and still having the same discipline, change is hard. I'm sure it caused some strife in the organization. But that's an amazing thing to accomplish for them. And so Jeff Sutherland, the creator of Scrum, called this combination a magic potion because leadership understood that you don't throw away control systems. You basically redesign them to support agility instead of stifling it. So CMMI ensured all relevant processes were considered, and Scrum ensured that those processes were implemented efficiently while, embracing the change that had to happen. But neither of those will work without leadership saying, we're creating something new here. All right. Now, the last one I want to talk about is Primavera Systems, and they were challenging themselves with, compliance without losing agility, and so they were more of a project management software company. They were kind of already doing these agile practices, but they needed an ISO 9000 certification for their customers. And so, when you start mentioning that, what's the fear of that is like, oh my gosh, well, that compliance will kill their agility with all the overhead. So leadership sponsored a 10-month effort where they conducted, 30 cross-functional workshops to document their process. And their mantra was provide just enough documentation to be useful and helpful with the process enforcement. I'd always add another one to that says, are we willing to maintain that documentation as well? And so a lot of times that's all the answers that need to be, all the questions that need to be answered on documentation. But if you notice the pattern in all three cases, leadership sponsored the change. They didn't delegate it to a transformation office and then walk away. They redesigned organizational systems like HR, finance, and operations, along with product development, all of them. They created this far from equilibrium conditions. They kept the organization adaptable, ready to evolve, instead of letting it settle back into its old pattern. And that's really what separates successful transformations to failed ones. Not the Scrum training, not the Kanban boards. Those are catalysts for sure. I love doing those things. But leadership, with its courage to say we are creating an agile organization, and that means everything changes, that's really what we need, because then the people can see that and see the urgency of that. Okay. So finally, what I want to talk about is your leadership journey that's required to create agility. So what do you do with all this? And so I wanted to give you a leadership framework for creating your agile organization. So step one is recognize that you're not just creating, you're transforming. You have to shift your mental model. You're not just rolling out Scrum, you're not just scaling Agile, you are creating an Agile organization. And so, what does that mean practically? Is that you're creating organizations that operates in a far from equilibrium condition. You're going to constantly be adapting and evolving, and you're going to be creating self-organizing teams that are supported by organizational systems that enable them, not control them. You're creating a learning organization where, continuous improvement is embedded in the very culture. It's not like some mandated thing from management. So when you talk about the three elements of this kind of transition that's required, basically I think about it as self-organizing teams, or we'll call that autonomy. We need enabling systems, and we need continuous evolution. Mike Cohn writes about this. He calls them, we need leaders who agitate, the organization. We want to keep it from settling into equilibrium. And that's your job as a leader. You're not the hero who has all the answers. You're basically the gardener who is creating the conditions where good things can grow. And so that's kind of the first step, is recognizing those things as we go. And the next one is to name the organizational gravity that might come in and get commitment to break it. So organizational gravity is whatever formed your organization into its current shape. What's pulling you back every time you try to do changes like this. And so what I'd like y'all to do is write down, start listing what are the organizational gravity elements. Is it annual performance reviews that reward individuals? Is it budget cycles that don't align with iterative delivery? Is it, facilities that prevent co-location or coordination? Is it finance that needs these phased gates? Is it operations that measure utilization over flow? Is it promotion systems that favor, our technical heroes over collaborative leaders? So you name it, you write it down, take it to the executive team, because here's the truth. You really can't fix organizational gravity from the middle. You need executive sponsorship and teams on the ground that are willing to push back on it. So change leaders, as Primavera writes in their case study, that adopting Agile requires an executive's sincere support. It can't be it can be a bumpy ride until things settle down. So we need our sincere support, and having executive support lets the learning take hold despite the many problems and features that can arise. And so you don't want just a checkbook only commitment from a sponsor. That's one of the most likely reasons your transformation will fail. Leaders must personally be engaged rather than just engaging others. Okay. And step 3 is your enterprise transition community. So Mike Cohn writes in Succeeding with Agile that we need an enterprise transition community. You can't do this alone. So you can call it whatever you want. Jeff Sutherland calls it an executive action team, or EAT, but it's basically a group of working agents from across the organization that meet in sprints. Yes, they practice Scrum too, that drive the transformation. It's not a steering committee that meets quarterly. It's a working group that commits to specific work each sprint, demonstrating progress at sprint reviews and retrospectives that, adapt their approach and ignite interest and provide air cover, is what I like to call it, for teams. And so these improvement communities will be spun up based on what our top problems are. You can't solve all problems at one time, so you got to prioritize them. So the ETC, or whatever you call it, needs a sponsor who participates, not someone who just initiated the change and walked away, someone who shows up, removes barriers, and demonstrates commitment. All right. Step 4, redesign your control systems. Don't just work around it. Okay. So these aren't just like, oh, we have these problems, let's fix it. So most transformations fail when they try to work around the existing control systems instead of redesigning them. So I find that you can't really have, individual performance reviews and team level accountability. You kind of have to redesign those things, and you can't have these phased gate funding initiatives and iterative delivery. You have to redesign how finance approves the work. You can't measure in operations on utilization and optimize for flow. You have to redesign for what you measure. And this is where leadership, I think, is absolutely essential, because the people who run those systems, they're not bad people. They're good people. They're trying to do the right thing, but they're running systems that were designed for a different world. And they basically need leaders who say, we're designing these systems and support the organization we're creating. We have to redesign them. All right. Last one is focusing on value streams, not hierarchies. So we want to stop, managing people and start managing the work. I've got a little image here of value stream mapping, and that's one of the best tools we can use. Like, where are the delays? Where does work sit in queues waiting? And those queues, where the value is going to die. And so this isn't about going faster. It's about eliminating waste and delay, being more effective. It's about shifting from everyone is busy to value is flowing. And, notice that optimizing a value stream requires you to work across all of these functions. HR has to help people develop skills that support flow. Finance has to enable fast decisions. Operations has to deploy quickly, or better yet, let the people building the product deploy. You're creating an organization aligned around value delivery and functional excellence. And so we want to keep the organization on its toes, far from equilibrium. Organizations operate like that are better suited for continuous change. And an organization that is in equilibrium, a lot of times will resist change. So leaders keep organizations on their toes by introducing variation, defining clear performance standards, and creating the conditions for evaluation. You can alter the containers, how teams are structured. You can amplify differences and make work great. You can transform exchanges as well. And that's what we call the containers, differences, and exchanges from Glenda Eoyang. So a lot of times leaders are worried about how do we manage, and get to the point where we can have self-organizing teams without managers interfering. And it's the containers, differences, and exchanges that we can subtly influence for the teams as we go forward. So you're not specifying behavior in advance. You're kind of guiding the evolution of those behaviors that emerge from those self-organizing teams. And that's what creating an agile organization looks like. So in closing, as we wrap up a lot of stuff we talked about, but we're going to kind of dive into it for the week. I want you to remember that creating an agile organization is not about what happens in it. It's about what happens everywhere, even around it. So you can have the most functioning Scrum teams in the world, but if HR is still rewarding individual heroics, if finance is still operating on annual budgets and phase gates, if operations still measure success and utilization rates and handle deployments, and that organizational gravity will pull you right back where you started. And I see it all of the time. So this is fundamentally a leadership challenge, not a process problem, not a training problem. It's not even really a leadership problem. What we want you to do is you're asking people to abandon the control systems that have shaped their entire careers, systems that have made sense in a world of predictability, stability, and low variance. And you're asking them to embrace a far from equilibrium condition, self-organization, and continuous evolution. They won't do that without leaders who focus on that. And so I found a nice little graphic that kind of shows over time the intensity of the sense of the new, practicing with peers and letting go of the legacy things that happen. And so we want to create conditions for evolution instead of specifying behavior. And so this is what we call the transformational change image that I like to show. It's very similar to the Virginia Satir change company or curve. And so I find that organizations that figure this out are not just faster or more productive, but they're creating organizations where people want to work. And that's important as well. We want learning to be continuous. We want focus to be on creating value, not looking busy. And so we want to create organizations that can, in a sense, respond to that, can evolve, and can thrive in uncertainty. So my challenge to you, if you're a leader, recognize that this is your work. You can't delegate creating an agile organization. You have to redesign the systems. You have to keep the organization on its toes, and you have to personally demonstrate what that agility looks like. If you're not in a leadership role yet, find a leader who gets this. Help them see the cost of organizational gravity, help them see the cost of hidden inventory, and understand what could be possible. Be part of the enterprise transition community that ignites change. This week, identify one control system, just one, that's creating friction. Schedule a conversation of a person who owns that system, not to tell them what they're doing wrong, you'll get defense real quick, but to understand their constraints and to explore how you might redesign it together. Because creating an agile organization isn't about IT transforming and dragging everyone else along. It's about the entire organization learning together and how to sense and respond to change. So that's what we do at Big Agile. If you need help with that, or we help leaders create that as well, we have classes for that. And kind of think of agility as the operating system. It's not just what our developers do. So if you found this helpful, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment about which control system creates the most friction in your organization. And I hope to see you next time or on one of our many outlets at Big Agile. Remember, you're not transforming, you're creating, and that requires leadership.